I had always been proud of our marriage, our home, and the life my wife Emma and I built over 15 years. We started from scratch, her working her way up in marketing, while I put in the years at a job in IT. We had 2 kids together, and our life was simple but rewarding. I never expected to find myself staring down the barrel of a revelation so ugly, it was like a punch to the gut. It all started subtly, as these things often do. Emma came home one evening looking elated, which I assume was from a work promotion she'd been after for months. We'd gone out to celebrate, our kids rolling their eyes at another work dinner. She kept saying how supportive her team had been, especially her boss. But it wasn't until the next morning that I noticed a slight shift. Emma was checking her phone constantly, guarding it like a hawk, which was unlike her. We always had an open relationship when it came to our devices. A little red flag went up, but I brushed it off, blaming it on my own insecurities. But things escalated when she started working late. The company was going through some big transitions, she'd say. The workload was intense. I knew promotions didn't come without a price, and yet, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just work keeping her out. I remember one night specifically. I'd made dinner, had the kids bathed and in bed, but she didn't walk in until nearly midnight. She apologized, said she lost track of time at the office, but she smelled like a high-end cologne I'd never worn, something woodsy and unmistakably masculine. I convinced myself I was overreacting, but doubts began taking root. After that, things changed between us. I started noticing little things, her texting late at night, saying she was stressed but smiling at her screen. When she caught me looking, she'd brush it off, saying it was just office chatter. There were times when I wanted to ask her to confront her, but I didn't. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who didn't trust his wife without proof. But I could feel the strain growing, the tension I tried to mask whenever the kids were around. Then came the breaking point. One Friday evening, she came home and I could see from her nervous smile that she was avoiding my gaze. She poured herself a drink and congratulated herself on finally nailing the project she'd been working on for weeks. The CEO was thrilled, she said, raising her glass. Something in her voice made my stomach turn. I stayed calm, forcing myself to play the part. So, you finally pleased the CEO, I said, keeping my tone even. Her eyes flashed with something, shock, maybe fear, but she quickly covered it up with a tight smile. I slid a USB drive across the table, watching her expression shift from confusion to dread as she took it. Go ahead, I said, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. Let's see if you can explain what's on here. I felt the words choke me, but I had to say them. In court, if necessary. She went pale, her hand shaking as she picked up the USB, her eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. And right then, I knew my suspicions hadn't been just a symptom of jealousy or paranoia. They were real. The evidence I'd collected wasn't just some gut feeling. I had messages, emails, images that told the whole story. Weeks of texts and hidden meetups she thought I'd never find out about. I didn't know exactly what I'd do next or how we'd manage the fallout, especially with the kids. But I did know one thing. The trust I'd given her freely for years was shattered, and there was no simple way to pick up the pieces. Emma's hand was shaking so much she almost dropped the USB. I watched her stare down at it, her face a mixture of panic and guilt, searching for something to say but coming up empty. I felt strangely calm, which was the exact opposite of what was going on inside me. It was like a dam was about to burst, but I was holding it back, trying to get every last ounce of truth from her. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up at me, her eyes already glossy with tears. This isn't what it looks like, Sam, she whispered. I scoffed, barely able to look at her. Then what is it, Emma? Tell me, because I'd really love to hear your version. She stammered for a moment, trying to gather herself, but her expression told me everything I needed to know. There was no explanation that would change what I'd already seen on that drive. The late nights at the office, her boss's flirty texts, their hotel meeting spots, the business dinners I'd pretended to believe in. I had proof that the person I'd loved, trusted, and built a life with had been slipping out of my hands all along. You have to understand, she started reaching out to me, but I pulled back, not willing to let her off that easily. Understand what, Emma? That this promotion was worth tearing apart our family? Or that our 15 years together wasn't worth the truth? My voice cracked, the anger I'd been holding back starting to slip out. How long were you going to keep this from me? Or were you ever planning on telling me at all? She looked down, and that was answer enough. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Do you have any idea what this does to us? To the kids? Her face crumpled at the mention of them. Please, Sam, just listen. I know I made a mistake, a horrible one, but I still love you. I've never stopped loving you. I shook my head, my chest tight. You know, that's what kills me the most. Because I loved you too, and I trusted you completely. I would have done anything for you, Emma. My voice dropped to a whisper. But you took advantage of that. You lied to me, day after day. For a moment, the room was silent. All I could hear was the soft hum of the refrigerator, and my own heart pounding in my chest. Where do we go from here, Sam? She asked, her voice barely audible. I could tell she wanted some reassurance, some way to know that maybe, just maybe, I'd find it in me to forgive her. But I wasn't ready to give her that. I don't know, I admitted, unable to look her in the eye. I don't know if there's a way forward. Right now, I need some space to think, to figure out what all this means. For me, for the kids, for our family. She nodded slowly, her face crumpling as she fought to hold back tears. I knew she was sorry. I could see it plain as day. But what she didn't realize was that sorry couldn't erase the betrayal, couldn't magically rebuild the trust she'd destroyed. I walked away, leaving her at the table, her head in her hands as she cried. It took everything in me not to turn back, not to go to her and comfort her. But I couldn't. Not this time. I headed up the stairs, feeling like I was climbing away from the life I'd once known, from the woman I'd once loved. Our family, our life, our story. It all felt like a memory, and I was the only one left clinging to it. That night, I slept in the guest room. Well, I tried to sleep. I mostly just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every tiny sound from the other side of the house. I could hear Emma moving around our room, probably putting away the clothes she'd thrown off earlier, trying to erase every last detail of the evening. I thought back to the life we'd built together, years of memories, of small moments that didn't seem important then, but now stood out in my mind, like bright little dots on a map. The time she brought me soup when I was sick, the trips we took with the kids, her laugh when I made some dumb joke, our shared glances across the dinner table when the kids were being funny or absurd. It was like I'd been living in this warm cocoon, not knowing the walls had been crumbling for God knows how long. The next morning, I came down to find her in the kitchen, sitting at the table, just staring at her coffee cup. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept either. But I didn't feel sorry for her. Not now. Do you want to talk about this? She asked, looking up at me as I poured my own coffee. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting, but I wasn't sure I had it in me to sit across from her without breaking. I don't know if there's anything to talk about right now, I said, my voice coming out colder than I'd intended. It's not like anything you say is going to make this go away. She nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the rim of her cup. I know that, Sam. But I want to try, for the kids' sake at least. The kids. God, the kids. We had two teenagers who were oblivious to all of this, thankfully. They were still sleeping, probably expecting to come down to a normal Saturday breakfast, with their mom making pancakes and their dad frying up bacon. I had no idea how we'd explain any of this to them, or even if I wanted to. You want to try now? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. Now that it's all out in the open? She flinched, and for a moment I felt a sting of regret. But then I remembered the weeks, maybe months of lies. The way she had come home each night and pretended everything was fine. I took a breath, steadying myself. Emma, do you understand how much you've broken here? The trust, the foundation of everything we've built? Her voice cracked. I do. And I'm sorry, I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am so sorry, Sam. She looked up, tears pooling in her eyes. Please, just give me a chance to make this right. I'll do anything. I was quiet for a long time, and the silence stretching between us. I need time, I finally said, forcing myself to meet her gaze. I don't know what I want yet. I don't know if I want to fix this, or if I even can. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I'll give you whatever time you need. The kids came down shortly after, interrupting the tension between us. Emma put on a brave face, poured them cereal, and made small talk, while I stayed silent, unable to force the words past the tightness in my throat. I looked at them, these two innocent kids who had no idea their whole world might be about to change. As they ate, I took my coffee and went outside to the porch, letting the crisp morning air hit my face. My mind was racing with a million thoughts, a million questions I didn't have answers to. How had we gotten here? Had I missed the signs, ignored something obvious? I heard the door open and Emma stepped outside, hovering by the door. I thought I'd take the kids out for a bit, she said quietly. Give you some space. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, I replied, not looking at her. She hesitated. Sam, whatever happens, I need you to know that I love you. I always have. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. As she left with the kids, I sat there alone on the porch, letting the silence settle around me, trying to figure out if there was any part of me that could ever believe her again. After they left, the silence in the house felt almost eerie. I wandered back inside, coffee in hand, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Our family pictures lined the walls, vacations, holidays, birthdays, and each one felt like a mocking reminder of the life I thought we'd shared. I couldn't look at them without feeling the sting of betrayal and confusion twist in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I couldn't sit still, couldn't just wait around and stew in my thoughts. So I started looking. First, in the kitchen drawers, where we kept everything from bills to loose change, searching for, I don't know what. Proof, maybe. Or maybe I just needed to feel like I was doing something, taking control of this wreckage of my life. It didn't take long before I found her work phone in her bag. I paused, knowing that going through her phone was a line I never thought I'd cross. But she'd already shattered every line of trust we had. So I told myself that the rules had changed. I braced myself and opened it, scrolling through her texts. A lot of them were the usual work chatter. But then I saw a thread with a name I didn't recognize. Darren, her CEO. My stomach twisted. I opened the thread, and it was right there, plain as day, in words that no husband should ever have to read. He'd sent her messages that dripped with flirtation, promises about next time, jokes about the late-night meetings they'd been having. I felt my chest tighten with every line, every little exchange they'd shared, talking like they had some inside joke, as if he'd taken the place in her life that belonged to me. She was laughing, joking, talking with him in ways she hadn't talked with me in ages. I threw the phone down, pressing my palms against my eyes, trying to stop the anger and heartbreak from boiling over. The reality of it was undeniable, but worse. I realized that this wasn't some one-time mistake, like she'd tried to tell me. This was a full-blown affair, something that had developed over time, built on lies, and the life we had built together was just the collateral damage. I felt myself spiraling, caught between anger, hurt, and a strange hollowness. It was like I was grieving. Yet the person I was grieving for was sitting in the same house with me, pretending that what we had was still real. I knew I couldn't let this slide. There was no sweeping this under the rug, no going back to some fantasy where I didn't know the truth. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the house, trying to figure out what to say to her, how to even confront her, now that I knew the full scope of what she'd done. By the time she got back, I'd worked myself up to the point where I was barely holding it together. She walked in with the kids, who quickly scattered upstairs, leaving us alone. I didn't waste any time. We need to talk, I said, my voice rough. Emma looked at me with worry, but nodded, following me into the living room. We stood there, both of us tense, waiting for the other to speak. Finally, I broke the silence. I went through your phone, I said, watching her reaction. Her face drained of the color, and I could see the panic in her eyes. You didn't just make one mistake, Emma. This was ongoing. You were having a full relationship with him behind my back. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, she choked out, Sam, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It was just, I was feeling lost, and he was there. I laughed, a bitter sound I didn't recognize coming from myself. He was there. Emma, I was here every day waiting, trusting you. You could have come to me if you felt lost. I was right here. She wiped her eyes, shaking her head. You wouldn't understand. Try me, I said, crossing my arms. Help me understand what makes a wife lie to her husband. Day after day, month after month. Explain to me what makes a mother risk her whole family just to feel a thrill with some guy from work. She shrank back, looking like she wanted to run, but I wasn't letting her off the hook. Do you even want to fix this, Emma? Or was that all just for show so you wouldn't have to feel guilty? Tears streamed down her face. Of course I want to fix it. I love you, Sam. I'm sorry. I messed everything up. I was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try and fix this. Please, just give me a chance. I took a long, hard look at her, feeling the ache in my chest. I didn't know if I could ever trust her again, or if the damage was too deep to repair. But what I did know was that I needed space to figure that out. I couldn't be around her, not with the raw wound of this betrayal open and bleeding. Maybe, I said slowly, choosing my words with care. Maybe there's a chance to fix this. But right now, I need space. I need time to sort through this on my own. I paused, swallowing hard. I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might argue, but she just nodded, defeated. She went upstairs to pack a bag, and a few minutes later, she was gone. I watched her drive away, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The house was quiet again, but this time, it felt different, emptier somehow. Like all the warmth and safety it once held had been drained, leaving only an echo of what we used to be. I sat down, alone in the silence, and tried to imagine what life would look like now, knowing everything had changed. That first night alone was brutal. I stayed up in the living room, staring at nothing, trying to process the wreckage of our marriage. I kept thinking back to moments with Emma over the years, trying to pinpoint where things started to go wrong. Was it something I missed, or something I did? I'd been so sure that what we had was unshakable. The kids came down the next morning, eyes puffy with sleep, oblivious to the fact that their mom wasn't home. "Where's Mom?" my daughter asked as she settled into her chair, pouring herself a bowl of cereal. My son, barely awake, looked up too, waiting for my answer. I hesitated, caught between the instinct to shield them from the ugliness of it all and the need to be honest. "Mom's staying with a friend for a while," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack. "She just needs some time to clear her head." They exchanged confused glances, but they didn't push. I could tell they sensed something was wrong, but they'd always been good kids, never the type to prod. As they ate, I busied myself with chores, avoiding their eyes, feeling like an imposter in my own home. I didn't know how I'd keep this up, but for now, it seemed like the only option. The rest of the day was a blur. I went through the motions of normal life, cleaning, paying bills, making dinner, but every once in a while, the weight of everything would come crashing down, and I'd have to stop and catch my breath, feeling like a part of me was missing. My mind kept wandering back to Emma's face that morning when I'd confronted her. The mixture of guilt and regret etched into her features. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone and hear her voice, to try and figure this out together. But every time the image of her laughing with another man, sharing secrets and moments that were supposed to be ours, pulled me back from that edge. That evening, after I'd put the kids to bed, I found myself scrolling through pictures on my phone. Photos of family vacations, birthdays, and quiet mornings where everything felt right. Each one was a reminder of the life we'd built, of the love I thought would always be there. And now? Now I didn't know if any of it had ever been real. I stopped on a photo from last Christmas. We were all gathered around the tree, Emma's arms wrapped around me, her smile as bright as ever. I remember thinking that was one of the best Christmases we'd ever had, so full of laughter, warmth, and hope for the new year. Looking at it now, I felt like I was seeing someone else's life, someone else's family. I had no idea how to bridge the gap between those memories and the reality I was living now. The days blurred together, each one a test of patience and strength I wasn't sure I had. I didn't reach out to Emma, and aside from a few texts to check on the kids, she kept her distance too. Friends and family started to notice her absence, asking if everything was okay, and each time I'd give some vague excuse about work or needing space. It felt like lying, and I hated it. But I also wasn't ready to open up about the mess my life had become. A week went by, and I found myself in the same place every night, sitting in our empty bedroom, staring at her side of the bed, wrestling with memories and anger and a crushing sadness I couldn't escape. I'd never felt so alone, and yet I didn't want anyone to know. I had to figure this out on my own terms. One night, after a particularly restless evening, I woke up to a message from Emma. It was simple, just one line. I'm so sorry for everything. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I stared at the screen, rereading her words. Part of me wanted to respond, to lash out, to make her feel the weight of the hurt she'd caused. But another part of me, buried deep beneath the anger, still cared, still wanted to understand. So I typed back, "We need to talk. Let's meet tomorrow." I hit send before I could second guess myself. The next day, I sat in a small coffee shop, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I waited for her. When she finally walked in, looking more worn than I'd ever seen her, I felt the same mixture of emotions bubble up: anger, hurt, and, God help me, love. She sat down across from me, her eyes searching mine, and for the first time since this nightmare started, we were face to face. "I know there's nothing I can say to make this right," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But I need you to know that I regret everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to understand if there's any part of you that still thinks we can work through this." I looked at her, wondering how we'd gotten here, how the woman I'd trusted with my whole heart could betray me so deeply. "Why, Emma?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why throw everything away for him?" Her eyes filled with tears. I don't know. I was feeling lost, like I was invisible in my own life. And he was there, saying things I hadn't heard in years, making me feel noticed. But it was wrong, and I see that now. I just want a chance to make it right. We talked for hours, digging through the broken pieces of our marriage, trying to understand what could be salvaged. By the end of it, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also relieved. It was the first time we'd had an honest conversation in years, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Leaving the coffee shop, I didn't know what the future held. There were no promises made, no guarantees of a happy ending, but there was a tentative understanding, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. That night, I couldn't get our conversation out of my head. We had finally been honest, stripped down to the raw pain and mess that lay between us. But something about her words still nagged at me, a strange feeling that kept scratching away at the back of my mind. She'd said she felt invisible in her own life, that he'd made her feel noticed. But why hadn't she come to me? Why turn to a man she barely knew? I tried to let it go, to let my exhausted mind rest, but sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, replaying our conversation over and over, feeling like there was a piece missing. The next morning, after the kids were off to school, I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee untouched, staring at her phone, the one she'd left behind by accident when she came over to pick up some things. My hands shook as I reached for it, torn between my instinct to respect her privacy and the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. Before I could talk myself out of it, I unlocked the phone, scrolling through her recent messages. Nothing unusual popped up at first, just work emails and conversations with friends. But then I saw a message thread with an unfamiliar number. Someone saved as D. Carter. My heart raced as I opened it. The first messages were nothing alarming. Basic work logistics, meetings, deadlines. But then, as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted. He was telling her how amazing she looked in that blue dress, how he couldn't stop thinking about her, how he'd never met anyone who understood him like she did. And then, as if a switch had flipped, the messages took a darker turn. One text from just a few weeks ago caught my eye. "Emma, you know what will happen if this gets out. I think it's in both our interests to keep this quiet." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just an affair. He was threatening her, controlling her. And from her responses, it was clear she'd been trying to end it, but he wouldn't let go. I scrolled further, feeling a sense of dread rise with each message I read. Darren wasn't just some fling. He was manipulating her, dragging her deeper into something she hadn't wanted. And from what I could see, he had no intention of letting her go. In fact, he seemed determined to keep her trapped, holding something over her head that she was too afraid to confront. Then, I found a voice message from Darren. My thumb hovered over it, my heart pounding. I pressed play, the sound of his voice filling the silent kitchen. Emma, let's not kid ourselves. You think you can walk away just like that? His voice was low, menacing. Remember, I know enough about you, your family, your life to make things difficult. Do you want that? Because trust me, I don't think your husband would handle the truth well. I don't think he'd be as understanding as you're hoping. I felt my blood turn to ice. This man, her CEO, the one she'd turned to when she felt lost, was using her vulnerability against her. And worse, he had no problem dragging me or our kids into his twisted game if it meant keeping control over her. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the phone, my mind racing. Every emotion I'd felt over the past few weeks came rushing back in full force. Anger, betrayal, hurt. But now, there was something new. Fear. Not just for myself, but for Emma, for our family. I knew I had to confront her to figure out what exactly we were dealing with. But I couldn't just go in blind. I needed to know the full story. And if Darren was the kind of man who'd threaten her, then I needed a plan. Without thinking too much about it, I called an old friend from college, Jake, who worked in private investigations. We hadn't spoken in years, but when he picked up, he recognized my voice instantly. I told him everything, how I'd found out about the affair, the messages, the threats. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he let out a long breath. Sam, this isn't just some run-of-the-mill affair, Jake said. If he's threatening her, holding something over her, that's dangerous territory. He's clearly got leverage, and guys like that don't give it up without a fight. You're going to need more than just texts if you want to protect your family. We came up with a plan. Jake would dig into Darren's background, see if he had a pattern of doing this. Meanwhile, I'd keep an eye on things at home, try to keep things as normal as possible while we worked to gather evidence. That night, Emma came over after the kids were asleep, wanting to talk. I'd arranged for the kids to sleep at my sister's for the night, just in case things got tense. She walked in looking drained, her eyes red and puffy. Sam, I know you probably hate me right now, she started, her voice shaky. But I swear, it was never about you. I was just scared. I didn't know how to get out of it. Scared? I asked, watching her carefully. Scared of him. Her eyes widened and she took a step back, shaking her head. No, I mean, it's complicated. Emma, I know he's been threatening you. I know he's got something on you, something that's keeping you in this. What I don't understand is why you didn't come to me. I forced myself to keep calm, to keep the anger in check. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Tears filled her eyes as she sat down, her shoulders slumping. Because I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me like this. Weak, manipulated, trapped. I thought I could handle it on my own. But you couldn't, I said, my voice breaking. And now, he's pulling our whole family into this mess. She nodded, covering her face with her hands. I'm so sorry, Sam. I wanted to tell you, but he said he'd destroy everything if I left. I didn't know how to make it stop. We sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. After a long pause, I reached over, taking her hand. Emma, we're going to get through this. I don't know how, but we're going to take him down. Together. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. You mean that? I nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. Yes, but this time we do it right. We expose him, get him out of our lives for good. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm, of purpose. Darren thought he could control her, control us, but he'd underestimated the strength of a man with something worth fighting for. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days felt like a countdown to something explosive, a tension so thick I could almost feel it pulsing through the house. Jake, my investigator friend, had uncovered more about Darren than I'd anticipated. Darren wasn't just a sleazebag CEO abusing his power. He was practically a career manipulator, someone who had been using and discarding people for years. Affairs, lawsuits, even a hidden assault charge buried deep in his past that he'd somehow wriggled out of. It was no wonder he'd threatened Emma to keep her trapped. But the best part? Jake had found evidence Darren was skimming money from his own company, shuffling it into a personal account, quietly building a nest egg no one else knew about. And Jake managed to get access to bank statements, enough to expose Darren's entire scheme. The plan we concocted was simple but ruthless. I wanted to bring Darren down in every way that mattered: his career, his money, his reputation. And Emma was on board with it, determined to make things right by putting the final nails in his coffin. For the first time in weeks, she seemed strong, ready to fight back. That Friday night, we set everything in motion. I'd arranged a meeting with Darren at a local bar under the guise of wanting to discuss amicable terms regarding his relationship with my wife. Predictably, his ego couldn't resist the opportunity to gloat, to act like he was the one in control. Meanwhile, Emma was already at his office, planting the incriminating financial documents Jake had dug up in a file cabinet, ready to be discovered by corporate investigators the following morning. With Jake's help, she'd also sent anonymous tips to both the board of directors and Darren's wife, hinting at his financial discrepancies and extracurricular activities. As soon as Darren walked into the bar, I could tell he thought he was untouchable. He smirked, swaggering over to my table like he owned the place. He sat across from me, all confidence and arrogance, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "So, Sam, I appreciate you wanting to settle this like a man," he said, barely hiding his smug grin. "Oh, I'm definitely settling it like a man," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're probably wondering why Emma chose me over you, but look, some people just need a little excitement. I can't help it if I bring that out in her." My fists clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You know, Darren, you're right. You do bring out something in people, especially when they find out what you've really been up to." I slid an envelope across the table. Inside were copies of his bank statements, a record of all his shady transactions. Darren's smirk faltered as he opened it, eyes widening as he flipped through the pages, his face paling with each passing second. "What the hell is this?" he stammered, trying to regain his composure. "Just a little insurance," I said, leaning forward. "Your dirty money, every dime of it. I thought I'd give your board a nice little show and tell, and maybe let your wife in on your extracurriculars too." He shot up from his chair, hissing, "You're bluffing. No one's going to believe some random documents you cooked up." "Oh, they'll believe them," I said with a cold smile. "See, my friend Jake has connections, and by morning, everyone in your life will know exactly who you are." Darren's face twisted in rage, his hands clenching as he tried to keep his composure. He leaned in, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're so clever, don't you? I'll make sure you regret this. Your wife? Your kids? You won't even know where I'll hit you next." Before I could respond, the door to the bar opened, and Emma stepped in. She'd timed it perfectly, slipping in just as I'd given Darren the final blow. He looked over, momentarily confused, and then his eyes narrowed as he realized she'd been part of the whole setup. Emma didn't say a word as she walked over, her face cold, her voice steady. "Darren, it's over. I'm done with you. And you're done, period." He laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, you think you can just walk away?" "I own you, Emma. I own both of you," he said, looking between us with fury. But then, in one of those moments that feels scripted, two men in suits walked in behind Emma. They weren't just any men. They were corporate auditors Jake had tipped off, and they walked straight up to Darren, identifying themselves and informing him he was under investigation. Darren's face drained of all color, his bravado crumbling as they started listing the evidence they'd uncovered. And the final blow. Right on cue, his phone buzzed. He looked down, checking it with shaky hands. Jake had just sent him a timed email from a fake corporate account, with the details of his investigation, letting him know he'd been exposed on every level. Darren's eyes widened, panic replacing the smugness he'd held onto so tightly. I couldn't resist the satisfaction that surged through me. Leaning forward, I looked him in the eyes. Looks like you're finally out of moves, Darren. You can't threaten or charm your way out of this one. The auditors escorted Darren out, his protests fading as they disappeared through the door. Emma and I stood there watching the man who had tried to destroy our family get taken down piece by piece. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lifting, a sense of justice I hadn't thought I'd ever find. Emma turned to me, her face a mixture of relief and sadness. Sam, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, she said quietly. But I'm grateful you gave me a chance to make things right. I looked at her, and for a moment, all the pain and betrayal felt a little less sharp. I don't know what the future holds, Emma, I replied, honesty in my voice. But tonight we took back control, and that's enough for now. We left the bar together, stepping out into the cool night air, both of us feeling a little lighter, a little more free. Darren was out of our lives for good, his career and reputation in ruins. He'd finally lost control, and we'd reclaimed our lives, one careful move at a time. Maybe we would rebuild, maybe we wouldn't. But tonight, we'd won. And for now, that was all that mattered.